The winter of 1885 was the kind that frontier settlements don't forget, the kind that turns decision-making into mathematics and mathematics into survival. Ironwood Gap, a cluster of 9 homesteads scattered across the Dakota Territory, just 32 miles northeast of the nearest railroad junction, faced temperatures that plummeted to -38 degrees on the 19th of February. That same winter, the Garrett family, a young couple with 2 children aged 5 and 7, nearly became a casualty not of the cold itself, but of mathematics. With a cord of firewood costing nearly $4 in a settlement where cash money was essentially mythological, the Garretts had rationed their wood supply expecting a winter that would peak around -15 degrees. They had miscalculated. By mid-February, with their woodpile depleted to almost nothing, and the thermometer refusing to rise above -30 for 11 consecutive days, they faced a choice: burn their interior wooden furniture and risk the cabin catching fire, or let the temperature inside drop and pray the children's body heat and whatever rags they could pile on the sleeping platforms would be sufficient. On February 22nd, their eldest daughter, Margaret, developed a fever that neighbors heard had climbed so high that her mother feared the child's mind had begun to leave her body. The younger boy, Thomas, stopped speaking for 6 days straight. When Reverend Tobias Spence finally rode out on horseback to check on them, he found Margaret still fevered but conscious, and Thomas wrapped in every textile the Garrett cabin possessed: 2 blankets, 3 quilts, 4 wool shawls, and a cavalry coat someone had traded years before. Inside that cabin, the thermometer hanging on the interior wall, a gift from the trading post owner, read 22 degrees at ground level and only 18 degrees on the sleeping platform where the children lay. The Garrett's single fireplace, which consumed an average of 2 full cords of wood per winter, could only warm the space immediately in front of it. The rest of the cabin remained a glacial expanse where warmth existed as memory rather than reality. The settlement, in its collective shock, realized that winter conditions on the frontier were not problems that individual families could solve individually anymore. What kept one family warm, Caleb Moorefield would later say, was what others decided to build. Caleb Moorefield was 42 years old, a former bricklayer from Hazleton, Pennsylvania, who had come west in 1883 to prove he could build something larger than other men's houses. He had started as a homesteader like the others, 140 acres, a soddy he built himself by cutting and stacking prairie sod like bricks. A small timber frame cabin constructed 2 years later when he had accumulated enough salvaged lumber and brick from a failed general store in the next territory over. Caleb understood heat in the way that people who have worked with brick and mortar understand heat. He had spent 15 years calculating where fire wanted to go, how temperature moved through materials, what speeds of draft were necessary to sustain flame, and what speeds would kill it. When the Garrett family crisis became public knowledge in March of 1886, whispered about in the settlement's single trading post, discussed after church services, debated in low voices around dinner tables, Caleb began thinking about what he had been taught in Pennsylvania about heat distribution in multi-room buildings. The brick chimneys and furnaces he had built for wealthy Hazleton lawyers and factory owners had used a principle that was, fundamentally, about waste. Each room got its own heating source, its own fireplace, its own chimney, its own fuel consumption, its own risk. But Caleb had once worked on a mansion that belonged to a coal merchant named Hoffman, a building that used a central furnace and underground brick flue channels to distribute heat to 4 parlors and 6 bedrooms. The system had cost Hoffman nearly $140, a princely sum in 1868, and it had worked perfectly for 11 winters before a structural failure forced its abandonment. Caleb had been there during the assessment of that failure, and he had understood exactly what had gone wrong. Limestone mortar used in the underground sections had not been properly fired. Moisture had crept in during the spring thaws, and the channels had begun to crack and fail. The solution, he understood, was simple. Use clay mortar instead of lime mortar in the underground sections, and use brick and stone selected specifically for their ability to withstand repeated heating and cooling cycles. By April of 1886, Caleb had a proposal. He would build a single central fire pit and flue system that could serve 4 cabins simultaneously. The central fire pit would be constructed 300 feet north of his own cabin, on a rise in the terrain where drainage would naturally slope away on all sides. From this central pit, he would excavate 4 underground channels, one running northeast to his own cabin at 92 feet, one running southeast to the Bjornson family's place at 187 feet, one running southwest to Pearl Hitchcock's widow's farm at 245 feet, and one running due north to Reverend Spence's house at 430 feet. The physics of the system was elegant and well established. Each channel would be 36 inches wide at the opening, 30 inches deep, and lined entirely with selected brick and clay mortar, with a gentle slope of 1 inch of drop per 20 feet of length. This slope would create natural draft. When the central fire heated the air inside the flue system to approximately 280 degrees, that heated air would naturally rise, creating pressure differentials that pulled cooler air from the return channels back toward the central fire pit. As this air moved through the channels, it would lose approximately 30 to 40 degrees per 100 feet of travel. But that still meant the air reaching each cabin's termination point would be between 160 and 210 degrees, depending on distance and insulation. The heat radiating from the brick itself as this air moved through the channels would warm the cabin floors at the terminus of each flue. Each cabin would have a sealed stone junction box buried beneath its floor, with the flue channel opening 3 feet below floor level and vents opening upward through the floor at intervals to release the heat and prevent dangerous pressure buildups. Each cabin would have an iron grate installed over the floor vents, removable for cleaning, but designed to distribute the heat evenly across the floor surface, rather than creating dangerous hot spots that could char wooden planks or create fire hazards. Caleb's calculations showed that even in the coldest conditions, when external temperatures reached minus 40 degrees, the stone junction boxes and the heat radiating from 3 feet of brick channels beneath each floor would maintain minimum floor temperatures of 60 to 70 degrees, compared to the freezing temperatures or barely above freezing conditions that individual fireplaces could provide. The entire project would require approximately 4,000 selected bricks, specifically bricks that had been fired at high temperatures and that could withstand repeated heating and cooling without cracking or spalling. It would require 500 linear feet of clay and stone, 20 feet of salvaged iron grating, lime mortar for the upper sections of the central pit, but clay mortar for all underground work. Caleb had calculated that the central fire pit would need to be fed with approximately 1 full cord of wood per week during the coldest months, January through March, providing enough heat energy to warm 4 separate cabins, compared to the 8 cords total that 4 individual cabins would require with their individual fireplaces. The cost would be approximately 80 cents per family if, and this was crucial, the community members contributed labor and salvaged materials that already existed within the settlement. The 4,000 bricks would come from the salvaged general store supplies and a collapsed sod shelter that had belonged to a homesteader who had abandoned his claim 3 years earlier. The clay mortar would be mixed from limestone deposits along the riverbed and clay soil excavated from the drainage areas around the central pit. Caleb presented this proposal in late April of 1886 during the first community gathering of the spring at the trading post. There were 9 families in Ironwood Gap. The settlement had no official governmental structure, no town board, no formal voting mechanism. Decisions happened through discussion, argument, and consensus, or more often, through the simple fact that some people had influence and others did not. Caleb's family represented one voice. Anders Bjornsson, a Norwegian immigrant who had arrived 5 years earlier with 3 sons and a wife, represented another. Pearl Hitchcock, whose husband had died in a livestock accident 4 years before, and who now ran her 140-acre claim with the help of her 2 eldest boys and her daughter, represented another. The other 6 families, the Spences, Reverend Tobias Spence, his wife Margaret, and their 4 children, the Whartons, the Metzlers, the Gills, the Penholder family, and the Larson family, ranged in their enthusiasm from skeptical to openly opposed. The Whartons owned the trading post and held considerable economic leverage over the community. The Metzlers had family connections back east that they referenced whenever frontier life became difficult. The Gills were recent arrivals, only 2 years into their homestead claim, and they deferred to established voices. The Larson family had experienced a crop failure the previous summer and had little surplus resources for anything experimental. Reverend Tobias Spence was the first to speak against the proposal. He was 58 years old, had come west to establish a church, and viewed frontier life through the lens of spiritual righteousness rather than practical engineering. As he explained it, the near tragedy of the Garrett family was not a problem to be solved through brick and ingenuity. It was a test from the Almighty, and the solution was prayer, community charity through the distribution of firewood from families who had managed their supplies wisely, and the gradual weeding out of those families who could not manage frontier life effectively. "We do not improve ourselves against divine will," Spence said, standing in the trading post with his arms folded. "The cold tests us. Those who fail the test should perhaps consider returning to the eastern cities, where comfort is more readily available." He continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a sermon. "This system you propose, Caleb, 4 families sharing one fire, it violates the natural order. A man's family should be self-sufficient, relying on their own labor and their own fireplace. By binding ourselves together through these underground channels, we make ourselves dependent on one another for basic survival. What happens when one family's carelessness allows that shared fire to die? What happens when someone refuses to contribute their share of wood to the common supply? We will have created not unity, but mutual vulnerability." The other skeptics in the room nodded. The Wharton family, who operated the trading post and who benefited from selling firewood at premium prices to families who had miscalculated their supply needs, had their own financial concerns about a system that would reduce fuel consumption. They said nothing directly, but their silence was meaningful, a silence that signaled to others that the trading post family did not support the project. Caleb listened, and then he asked a direct question. "Reverend, do you have children?" Spence did, 4 of them, the youngest being 11. "Then you know what it is to wake in the night to the sound of them coughing. You know what it is to check on them in their beds and find their faces flushed with fever. The mathematics of comfort and survival are not separate things on the frontier. A child who survives with a fever is still a child who survived. Anders Bjornsson, who had been silent through this exchange, then spoke. His English was still thickly accented, carrying the Swedish undulations of his Norwegian background. I have 3 sons. When they are cold, they do not learn Christian virtue. They learn that we failed them. But he did not commit to the project. Instead, he said he wanted to consult with his wife, wanted to think about the labor involved, wanted to understand whether his family's cabin would be warm enough through the worst part of winter. In Norway, Anders said slowly, as if translating thoughts from his native language into English. We had the guild system. A man learned a trade, and the guild protected the knowledge, protected the quality of work. Here on the frontier, there is no guild. You have shown us mathematics on paper, Caleb, but brick channels underground? This is not something we can test first in small measure. This is a commitment to dig, to build, to change the very ground beneath our homes. He looked directly at Caleb. If this fails, the channels remain. They remain as evidence that we wasted labor and materials and hope. A man's reputation does not recover quickly from such failure. Caleb understood this hesitation. It was not opposition, but skepticism born of experience. The frontier did not reward those who committed to untested ideas. It rewarded those who had already succeeded and could point to their success as evidence of their competence. Caleb had only his Pennsylvania experience and his calculations. He had not yet built anything substantial in Dakota Territory. His soddy was functional but ordinary. His cabin was well constructed, but no better than Anders' cabin or Pearl's cabin. Pearl Hitchcock was different. She listened to Caleb's explanation of the flue system, asked 3 specific technical questions. What happened if a channel collapsed underground? How would they clear blockages? And what was the actual cost of materials and cash money? And then said simply, I have a daughter. She is 12. Last winter she coughed for 6 weeks straight because the cabin was too cold. She coughed so much that I thought her lungs might simply fail her. I held her at night when the fever came, and I realized that no amount of prayer was going to keep her warm if the cabin itself was freezing. If this works, I will be the warmest woman on the frontier. And if it fails, well, I've failed at worse things. Pearl's voice did not waver. She did not apologize for contradicting Reverend Spence, who seemed slightly stunned that a woman had spoken so directly and so publicly in opposition to his spiritual authority. Pearl had buried her husband 4 years ago without the luxury of grief. Grief was a luxury that required childcare and financial security, and she had neither. She had learned that problems either had practical solutions or they killed you. Spiritual acceptance was for people who had the option of acceptance. She did not. Pearl's commitment changed the calculation for Anders. 3 days later, Anders came to Caleb's cabin and said he wanted to see the technical drawings, wanted to understand exactly what was involved. Caleb spent an evening walking through the mathematics with him. The brick count per linear foot, 23 bricks per linear foot for a 3-foot deep channel section. The pitch angles, the slope calculations of 1 inch per 20 feet, the temperatures that clay and brick could withstand. Fired brick could handle repeated cycles between 290 degrees and ambient air temperature without cracking, but only if it had been properly fired in the initial manufacturing. Anders brought a notebook and sketched the system himself, asking Caleb to verify each calculation. A channel 187 feet long, Anders said, slowly, working through the mathematics. That is roughly 1 inch of drop per 20 feet of drop would be 9.5 inches of total drop. So the channel would terminate at 9.5 inches below the starting elevation at the central pit. Caleb nodded. Exactly. The natural draft pushes the hot air against that slight gravity resistance. But the draft is stronger than gravity. The warmer air wants to rise, and it does. Anders traced a diagram on his paper. And the heat. You say the air temperature drops 30 to 40 degrees per 100 feet of channel? In theoretical conditions, Caleb said. The actual heat loss will depend on how well we insulate the channels with clay and stone, how well we seal the joints, how much air is actually moving through at any given moment. In practice, my Pennsylvania experience suggests the air will reach each cabin at somewhere between 160 and 200 degrees. By the time they finished, Anders had moved from skepticism to grudging belief. In Norway, we had no such systems, he said. But we did not have minus 40 degrees either, and we did not have 4 families living in 4 separate boxes when one fire could warm all of them. If the mathematics are correct, and if we build it correctly, then yes, this could work. The announcement that Caleb, Pearl, and Anders, 3 of 9 families, would begin construction came in early May of 1886. Reverend Spence and the Whartons made their position clear. They would not participate, they believed the project was a waste of resources, and they remained confident that traditional solutions to frontier winters were sufficient. The other families adopted a wait-and-see posture. If the system failed, they wanted no part of it. If it succeeded, they would reconsider. Caleb understood this perfectly. Frontier people did not invest in experiments. They invested in certainties. The Metzlers and the Gills and the Larsons had decided to not commit, which meant that Caleb had lost the northern branch of the flue system. Without the Gills and the Larsons, Reverend Spence's cabin would receive no heat from the system. That branch would terminate at the Penholder family's claim, and the Penholders had also declined to participate. In practical terms, that meant Caleb's original plan for 4 branches would become 3 branches, and the 4th channel running due north would either remain unfinished or would terminate somewhere in the middle distance between the central pit and the Spence cabin, delivering heat to no one. But Caleb had decided not to argue. 3 families, 3 cabins kept warm through the worst months of winter, represented a significant accomplishment. If the system worked, the other families would eventually demand access. If it failed, Caleb would not have wasted their labor and resources. The digging began on May 12, 1886. Caleb, Anders, Pearl, and 2 young men from the community, 16-year-old Henrik Sorensen, Anders' oldest nephew, visiting from a neighboring claim, and 18-year-old Thomas Gill, the eldest Gill son whose family had declined participation, but whose son needed cash wages to buy summer clothing, set out with shovels and mattocks to break the ground at the site of the central fire pit. The location was on the high ground that Caleb had selected, a slight rise approximately 300 feet north of his own cabin, 92 feet east of the Bjornson place, 217 feet west of Pearl Hitchcock's house. The ground was still partially frozen. The previous day's temperature had been only 45 degrees, and while the frost was breaking up, the earth still held considerable resistance. The first hole, the central pit, which would be 8 feet deep, 15 feet long, and 10 feet wide, required careful planning. Caleb had measured out the site using a 100-foot rope and wooden stakes, marking the ground with piles of stones at the cardinal points. The 3 flue channels would radiate from the corners of this pit at specific angles. The northeast channel at a bearing of 45 degrees, the southeast channel at a bearing of 135 degrees, and the southwest channel at a bearing of 225 degrees. Each channel needed to drop exactly 1 inch for every 20 feet of length, which meant the northeast channel, which would run 92 feet to Anders Bjornsson's cabin, would drop approximately 4.5 inches over its length. The southeast channel, running 217 feet to Pearl's cabin, would drop approximately 10.75 inches. This precision was critical. If the slope was too steep, water would accumulate in low spots during spring thaws and freeze during winter, cracking the channels. If the slope was too shallow, the draft would not move the air efficiently through the system, and the heat would not reach the cabins. The math had to be perfect. Caleb used a simple level device he had constructed from wood and a water-filled tube of glass salvaged from an old lantern. By balancing this across vertical measuring rods, he could verify that each section of the channel slope was exactly correct. As Anders drove the first mattock into the frozen ground, he turned to Caleb and said, "If this works, we will have set a precedent." Caleb was already thinking about the next phase, the bricklaying, the mortar mixing, the precision work that would require knowledge and patience, an understanding of heat and material behavior that most frontier people simply did not possess. The 5,000 bricks needed to be selected and staged. The clay mortar needed to be calculated in the exact proportions that Caleb had learned in Pennsylvania. The limestone deposit along the river needed to be tested to ensure it was calcium-rich enough to produce quality lime mortar for the upper sections. The stone for the channel lining needed to be gathered and cut. But Caleb nodded at Anders and said, "If it works, we will have proven that engineering is stronger than winter." The digging would take 2 weeks. The brick preparation and stone selection would take 3 more. The brick laying would take 8. The mortar curing would take another 6, and that was assuming no failures, no collapsed sections that would need to be rebuilt, no structural problems that would require redesign. And then, in November of 1886, when the first real cold arrived, the kind that made thermometers fall below -20 degrees and kept them there for days at a time, Caleb Moorefield would light the first fire in the central flue system, and 3 families would begin the experiment that would define not only their winter, but the future of Ironwood Gap settlement itself. But that moment was still 6 months away. For now, there was only the sound of mattocks breaking frozen earth, the sight of men working in the spring sunlight, Pearl Hitchcock managing the water and the food supplies for the workers, and the weight of a single untested idea that might warm or might fail, that might save lives or might prove Reverend Spence correct in his belief that some problems on the frontier had no solutions but patience, prayer, and acceptance. The digging began in late August 1886, when the summer heat still held the northern plains like a blanket, and Caleb Moorefield surveyed the landscape between the 4 homesteads with the eye of a man who had spent 20 years laying brick for frontier saloons and trading posts. The central fire pit would sit on neutral ground, a patch of hardpan exactly 112 feet from Caleb's north-facing cabin wall, 87 feet from Pearl Hitchcock's place, 130 feet from Anders Bjornsson's structure, and 79 feet from Reverend Tobias Spence's timber cottage. Caleb had measured each distance twice using a hemp rope marked at every 10 feet, because precision in thermal engineering was not a luxury. It was the difference between survival and the sort of winter death that left children rigid beneath wool blankets. The channels would not all be equal length, but they would all function on the same principle. Heat rises, and if you slope the path downward from the source, heat travels upward naturally, pushed by convection, flowing invisibly through underground passages like blood through veins. 4 channels, each approximately 60 to 80 feet long, depending on final cabin locations, each 3 feet deep and 14 inches wide. Dimensions Caleb had calculated based on the draft patterns of old kiln fires he had tended in Nebraska. The slope would be slight but critical, 1 inch of descent for every 8 feet of horizontal channel length. This meant the channel running to Pearl's cabin at 80 feet would drop exactly 10 inches from fire pit to terminus. The channel to Anders would drop 9 inches. The channels to Caleb's own cabin and to the Reverend would be shorter, dropping 6 inches and 8 inches respectively. These slopes were not random. They had been engineered into existence by a man who understood that hot air, given even the smallest advantage, would move through a sealed passage with the consistency of breath-leaving lungs. The work began with Caleb and Pearl Hitchcock standing at the boundary of neutral ground, shovels in hand, as the late August sun bleached the sky nearly white. Pearl wore a wide-brimmed hat of woven straw and a canvas apron over her ordinary dress, and she had come prepared not to supervise, but to dig. She had 2 children to keep warm through the coming winter, Margaret, age 9, and Thomas, age 7, and she had watched other families in Ironwood Gap slowly surrender to the cold, their cabins shrinking into silence by March. Caleb marked out the central fire pit location with 4 wooden stakes and white chalk, a perfect square roughly 4 feet across, sunk 4 feet deep into the earth. This was the furnace. This was where a single fire, properly fed with wood from dawn until dusk, would push heat through all 4 channels with enough force to warm 4 cabin floors simultaneously. The brickwork around this central pit would be the most labor-intensive part of the entire project. Caleb had calculated that he would need approximately 350 bricks salvaged from a collapsed structure near the old trading post at Mercy Creek, bricks he had already negotiated to haul for a price of 4 cents total, plus the labor. He had also negotiated for scrap brick from 3 other sources: a failed mercantile, a collapsed barn foundation, and a burned-out stable. By late August, he had stockpiled nearly 500 bricks, sorted by size and condition. The morning digging for the central pit took all of August 23rd. Caleb worked the perimeter with a sharp shovel while Pearl hauled the loosened earth in a wooden bucket, dumping it into piles to be used later for backfill. Anders Bjornsson appeared around midday, his expression skeptical, but his arms powerful. He did not volunteer with words. He simply retrieved a shovel from Caleb's shed and began working. By evening, the central pit was dug to specification, 4 feet deep, the bottom leveled with river sand so that settling would not crack the brick foundation. Reverend Spence, observing from a distance near his cottage, shook his head and returned inside. The brick foundation of the central fire pit took 4 full days, working dawn to dusk. Caleb laid them in a tight, overlapping pattern, using a mortar composed of riverbank clay, lime made from burned limestone. Caleb had burned the limestone himself over 3 days in a makeshift kiln, and sharp sand from the creek bed. The proportions were critical: 3 parts sand to 1 part lime to 2 parts clay, all mixed with just enough water to achieve the consistency of thick butter. Pearl hauled the clay from the riverbank in 6-gallon buckets, making the journey from a site half a mile south where the earth was clay-rich and soft. She made this journey 17 times on the first day, 32 times on the second day, and by the fourth day, her hands were blistered and her shoes perpetually muddy, but she refused the offer of help from any man who had questioned Caleb's sanity in the weeks prior. The mortar was mixed in a large wooden trough using a shovel and the back end of a hoe. The consistency had to be exact, too dry, and it would not bond, too wet, and the bricks would slide. Caleb mixed and remixed until the mortar held a peak when lifted. By September 1st, the 4 walls of the central fire pit stood 4 feet high, bricked solid, the mortar curing in the late summer heat. The interior of the pit was lined with clay and sand to form a solid base for the iron grate, which Caleb had salvaged from a failed foundry near the Missouri River. The grate measured 30 inches by 30 inches and was heavy enough to require 3 men to position. Anders and Caleb lowered it carefully onto a support structure of flat stones, positioned so that air could flow beneath it. Above the grate, the hot gases from the fire would rise into the central chamber, then be drawn downward and outward through the 4 channels by convection pressure. The whole system relied on the fact that air, when heated, expands and becomes less dense, rising naturally. If the channels sloped downward from the fire pit, the hot air would push its way through them like water running downhill, and by the time the heated air reached the terminus of each channel, it would still be warm enough to heat the brick heatsink pad buried beneath each cabin floor. This was not magic. This was physics, understood since ancient Rome, where hypocausts had warmed the floors of emperors. The mouth of each channel required careful construction. At the point where each channel began its descent from the fire pit, Caleb built a small transition chamber lined with brick, designed to distribute the hot gases evenly into the channel and prevent turbulence. He used flat brick pieces to form a seal at the top, leaving only the narrow opening of the channel itself. The channels themselves were dug starting September 2nd and completed by September 22nd. Each channel was surveyed with a long wooden straight edge and a level, ensuring the proper 1 inch per 8 feet slope. Caleb drove wooden pegs into the earth at 10-foot intervals along each planned channel route, marking the exact depth required at that point. A channel 2 feet from the fire pit would be 3 feet 11 inches deep. At 40 feet, it would be 3 feet 4 inches deep. At 80 feet, the terminal distance to Pearl's cabin, it would be approximately 2 feet 11 inches deep, still well below the frost line, which, in Dakota territory in winter, extended to 6 feet in the worst years. The channels were lined with brick once dug, a laborious process. Caleb and Anders worked together, fitting bricks into the side and floor of each channel, using the same clay-lime mortar. The brick lining had to be thick enough to retain heat, but not so thick as to reduce the channel's interior dimensions below 14 inches wide. This width was critical. Too narrow an air resistance would slow the flow. Too wide and the brick would not have enough thermal mass to absorb and radiate heat effectively. By mid-September, Pearl had hauled more than 300 buckets of clay from the riverbank. Her shoulders had broadened from the work, and her hands had hardened. She had also developed a system. She walked the path early in the morning before the heat was brutal, returned at midday to rest in the shade of her cabin, and walked again in late afternoon. She brought a water barrel on a small cart now, which Anders Bjornsson had modified for her after the first week, adding better wheels and a reinforced frame. Anders still said nothing directly to Caleb about his change of heart, but the modification to the cart was its own language. By late September, the 4 channels were complete. The channel to Caleb's cabin ran 79 feet and dropped 6 inches across its length. The channel to Pearl's cabin ran 80 feet and dropped 10 inches, the steepest slope of all 4, because Pearl's cabin sat the farthest from the central pit. The channel to Anders's cabin ran 87 feet and dropped 9 inches. The channel to Reverend Spence's cottage ran 74 feet and dropped 6 inches. Each channel had a slight transition point near its terminus, a widening where the brick narrowed and where the heat-sink pad would be positioned. This heat-sink pad was crucial to the entire system. Once the channels were complete and sealed with flat stone cap slabs and a layer of clay, applied fresh and left to cure in the September sun, Caleb began the work of installing the heat-sink pads. Each pad was a 4-foot by 4-foot square of carefully stacked brick, positioned so that the channel terminated directly beneath it. The channel mouth opened upward into this brick mass. When hot air arrived through the channel, it would burst upward into the brick pad, and the brick, dark, dense, thermally massive, would absorb the heat. Brick releases heat slowly. A 4-foot by 4-foot pad containing perhaps 60 bricks would heat up over several hours and then release that heat upward into the cabin floor through the night. The pads were covered with wooden planks, and then, in Caleb's cabin and Pearl's cabin, with the cabin floors themselves. Reverend Spence's pad would remain sealed under a wooden cover in the basement space beneath his cottage, but the heat would rise through the floorboards nonetheless. Each heatsink pad was mortared with the same careful precision as the fire pit itself. By October 2nd, all 4 pads were in place. The underground flue system was complete. The total cost, as Caleb had promised, stood at 80 cents. 4 cents for the salvaged bricks from Mercy Creek, 12 cents for clay and sand hauled from the river, paid to a local boy for his labor, 8 cents for lime burned from local limestone, and the remaining 56 cents divided among miscellaneous materials, salvaged iron piping to seal the channels, wooden planks for the caps, and wooden support frames for the heatsink pads. The system had consumed approximately 250 man-hours of labor, nearly all of it volunteer. Pearl had contributed 40 hours herself, Anders 35, and Caleb the remainder, working alone in the early mornings and late evenings. Reverend Spence had contributed 0 hours, though he had offered frequent commentary. On the morning of October 10th, 1886, as the first hard frost of autumn rimed the prairie grass white, Caleb prepared to fire the system for the first time. He had stockpiled cut and split firewood, pine and cottonwood, both available locally and both adequate for heat, though not ideal. The central fire pit required a specific type of fire, hot, steady, and fed continuously. A roaring blaze would waste energy as sparks and smoke. A smoldering fire would not achieve the temperature necessary to push heat through 80 feet of channel. Caleb built his fire carefully, creating a base of kindling, then laying split wood in a crosshatch pattern that allowed air to flow freely beneath and between the pieces. As the wood caught, he fed the fire steadily, adding pieces only when the previous layer had achieved a bright orange glow. By 9 a.m., the fire in the central pit was burning hot and clean, with a temperature at the grate of approximately 420 degrees Fahrenheit, a heat Caleb could feel radiating outward through the brick walls of the fire pit. The first sign that the system was working came from Anders. He had gone inside his cabin and placed his palm flat against the brick pad beneath his floor. After 5 minutes, He returned outside and retrieved his hand, then walked back to Caleb without speaking. 20 minutes passed. Then Anders approached Caleb at the fire pit and held out his hand. It was warm in a way that suggested the heat from the central fire, traveling 87 feet through a brick channel buried 4 feet underground, had arrived intact and was being radiated upward through his cabin floor. Anders looked at Caleb for a full minute without speaking. Then he turned and walked back to his property, returning an hour later with additional bricks, 24 of them, salvaged from his own collapsed grain shed. "We should reinforce the pad," he said. It was the first time he had spoken a complete sentence about the project in Caleb's presence. Caleb nodded and said nothing, understanding that silence sometimes was the best response to a man's shift in perspective. Within 4 hours of lighting the fire, all 4 cabins reported warmth. Pearl Hitchcock reported that her cabin floor, which had been unpleasantly cold to barefoot children in the mornings, was now warm enough that Margaret and Thomas could walk across it without complaint. Caleb's own cabin achieved a floor temperature of approximately 68 degrees Fahrenheit, measured using a thermometer he had ordered from back east. His cabin's air temperature, without any additional heating beyond what the floor provided, reached 56 degrees by noon and held steady. This was not tropical comfort, but it was the difference between survival and suffering, between children sleeping through the night and children waking with cold, stiffened joints. Reverend Spence, when he tested his cabin's floor in the afternoon, found it warm. His expression was difficult to read, but he did not dismiss the findings. Instead, he went to his cabin and returned with a wool blanket, which he spread out on the section of floor nearest his fireplace. Then he sat on the blanket and closed his eyes. He did not speak to Caleb that day, and he did not volunteer any praise for the system. But he also, notably, did not suggest that it was foolish or that real winter would prove the whole enterprise a failure. The test fire burned continuously for 8 hours, consuming approximately 3/4 of a cord of split wood. By the time Caleb let the fire die down in the late afternoon, every cabin floor was demonstrably warm. Every cabin's interior had achieved a temperature above 50 degrees, and the 4 families of Ironwood Gap had, for the first time in the brief history of their settlement, a unified system of thermal protection. Reverend Spence, standing near the dying fire as evening approached, finally spoke. "We shall see what the actual winter brings," he said. It was not praise, but it was not dismissal either. It was the statement of a man whose skepticism had been confronted with evidence, and who was honest enough to acknowledge that evidence, even if he was not yet willing to declare victory. Anders Bjornsson, by contrast, was already making plans. He pulled Caleb aside as darkness fell and asked a direct question. "Can we extend it to include the school?" The school sat another 120 feet distant from Reverend Spence's cottage and served the 14 children of Ironwood Gap. Its floor, come winter, would be cold enough that learning became impossible by December. "We can," Caleb said, "but it would mean another 120 feet of channel, another heat sink pad, and more wood burned to maintain the central fire." Anders nodded slowly, calculating. "What would it cost?" "Perhaps another $2, Caleb said, "and 40 hours of labor." Anders looked at the central fire pit, at the brick walls that he himself had helped lay, at the channels that ran invisibly beneath the earth, carrying heat like underground rivers. "I will bring more brick," he said. This was the moment that Caleb understood the full consequence of what he had built. It was not merely a system for warming cabins. It was a demonstration that problems could be solved with ingenuity, salvaged materials, and community labor. It was proof that the frontier, for all its harshness, did not demand that families surrender to the cold as inevitable. And it was the moment when the impossible became, in the minds of his neighbors, merely difficult. The test fire marked the boundary between doubt and possibility. Winter was coming. The system had passed its first trial. In the weeks ahead, with real cold approaching, temperatures that would fall to -20, -30, and eventually to the 41 degrees below zero that the February blizzard would bring, the four families would learn exactly what their investment had purchased. But that story, the story of winter itself, was still ahead of them. For now, in October 1886, the underground flue was complete, proven, and ready. The blizzard arrived on December 12, 1886, 3 days after Reverend Tobias Spence had shaken his head at the underground flue system with a final pronouncement, "We'll know in January." Caleb Moorefield knew sooner. The wind came from the northwest at first light, carrying with it a wall of snow so thick that visibility dropped to 8 feet. Within 2 hours, drifts had begun to form against the exposed north side of the settlement, accumulating at a rate of nearly 1 foot per hour. By noon, the snow had reached 7 feet high against Pearl Hitchcock's cabin, blocking 2 of her 3 windows entirely. The thermometer nailed to the outside of the parsonage read -8 degrees Fahrenheit. By sunset, it had plummeted to -19 degrees Fahrenheit. The families huddled in their homes and waited. This was the kind of storm that decided whether a settlement survived or scattered to the next supply point. Caleb moved into the shelter cottage, the small structure built directly above the central fire pit, on the morning of December 13th. The fire pit itself was a marvel of practical engineering that had taken him weeks to perfect. Measuring 4 feet deep and 6 feet in diameter, it was lined entirely with fired brick laid in clay mortar. The bottom sloped slightly toward a narrow drainage channel that Caleb had carved into the bedrock itself. Above, a chimney of loosely stacked stone and clay rose 8 feet through the shelter's roof, designed to create just enough draft to pull heat down and out through the 4 main flues without creating a roaring fire that would consume wood at a ruinous rate. The fire pit sat at the intersection of 4 radiating channels, the eastern flue running beneath the Moorefield cabin, the western beneath Pearl's, the northern beneath Anders Bjornson's, and the southern toward where Reverend Spence's parsonage stood, though the Reverend had refused Caleb's offer to extend the system that far. Caleb had built the shelter cottage with walls of stacked logs and a single door facing east, positioned away from the worst of the winter winds. Inside, there was room only for the fire pit itself, a bench, a water barrel, and a small shelf for fuel staging. A log book hung from a nail, and Caleb had already begun recording temperatures and fuel consumption on the first page. For the first 18 hours of the blizzard, Caleb maintained the central fire at a carefully metered burn. He had calculated during the October test that a fire burning at a slow, steady rate, consumed at roughly 6 logs every 6 hours, would maintain the cabin floors at a temperature of between 45 degrees Fahrenheit and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on outside conditions and how much wind was pushing against each cabin's exterior. He fed the fire at 6-hour intervals, once at dawn, once at midday, once at dusk, and once just before midnight. Each feeding took approximately 30 minutes. He brought the logs from the stack beneath a lean-to shelter he had built 50 feet north of the fire pit, moving through the storm with a cord tied around his waist, anchored to a post outside the shelter cottage door, a precaution against becoming disoriented in the blinding snow. By the evening of December 13th, after just one day of the blizzard, he had burned 8 logs. He calculated that at this consumption rate, and with the 247 logs he had stockpiled, he could sustain the system for more than 180 days, well past the end of March, when winter truly began to release its grip on Dakota territory. Inside the Moorefield cabin, Sarah Moorefield and their 2 children felt the warmth rising through the floor in the first hours of the blizzard with a sense of profound relief. She had watched the system being built with skepticism equal to that of Reverend Spence, but the October test had convinced her. Now, with the wind outside howling at a pitch that seemed almost alive, the floor beneath her feet radiated a steady warmth. The thermometer inside the cabin read 52 degrees Fahrenheit by the afternoon of December 13th. She kept the children close to the floor where the warmth was strongest, and rationed the small supply of firewood she had kept in the cabin for emergency use. There would be no need for it now. In Pearl Hitchcock's cabin to the west, conditions were similar. Pearl, a widow for 9 years and a woman accustomed to managing scarcity, had observed Caleb's construction with the careful attention of someone who understood that engineering could mean the difference between comfort and suffering. She had fed Caleb and the other workers throughout the autumn, keeping their energy steady, and she had asked more questions about the design than anyone else in the settlement, except Caleb himself. Now she sat in her main room, watching the snow pile against her windows, and felt the floor begin to warm beneath her feet. By late afternoon, she had brought in 2 chairs and a small table from her bedroom and positioned them directly over the heatsink pad. There, with her small library of books and a cup of chicory coffee, she could wait out the storm in a state that approached comfort. The temperature inside her cabin climbed to 51 degrees Fahrenheit by evening. Anders Bjornsson, who had moved from his initial skepticism to enthusiastic support once he understood the mathematics of the system, had made a series of small improvements to his cabin's interior in preparation for the test. He had caulked every crack in the walls with clay and straw. He had sealed the gaps around his door and window with leather strips, and he had built a low barrier along the north wall to stop the wind from creating eddies that might disrupt the heat rising from the brick pad. Now those preparations paid dividends. The floor of his cabin, positioned north of the central fire pit, and therefore receiving the full force of the blizzard's northern winds, nonetheless maintained a temperature of 48 degrees Fahrenheit by the evening of December 13th. He had invited 3 neighbors whose cabins stood isolated and beginning to show the strain of the blizzard, families whose own fuel supplies were already being depleted at rates that would not sustain them through a storm of this magnitude. They clustered in the warmest part of his cabin near the brick heatsink pad and waited. By December 14th, the second full day of the blizzard, the situation in the other 5 cabins of Ironwood Gap had begun to deteriorate. Reverend Spence, despite his earlier dismissal of the underground flue system, found himself in the position of burning through his wood supply at a rate that he calculated would leave him with insufficient fuel for more than another week. His cabin was drafty, poorly sealed against the wind, and his fireplace was an open-faced model designed more for ambiance than efficiency. The blizzard was consuming nearly 1 log every 2 hours. His wife, Margaret, had begun the quiet work of calculating ratios and possibilities and by the afternoon of December 14th, she had concluded that they faced a genuine crisis. It was not yet Christmas. Winter had 9 weeks remaining. Other families in the settlement were in even worse circumstance. The McAllister family, the Hendersons, the Kowalskis, all burning wood at unsustainable rates. On the morning of December 15th, when Caleb made his regular 6-hour check of the fire pit, he found Reverend Spence standing outside the shelter cottage, nearly buried in drifted snow. Spence said nothing about his earlier skepticism. Instead, he said simply, "My wife and children are cold." Caleb did not make him ask directly. He simply nodded and said, "Bring them to Pearl's cabin. There's room, and the floor there is warmest. Anders is also sheltering neighbors there." Spence's face showed no expression, neither gratitude nor humiliation, but he turned and made his way back through the storm. Within the hour, Margaret Spence and the Reverend's 3 children had arrived at Pearl Hitchcock's cabin, their belongings wrapped in blankets and tied with rope. Pearl had already begun preparing space, and she made room for them with the efficiency of a woman who had managed scarcity her entire life. That evening, 9 people sheltered in Pearl's main room and bedroom, arranged in shifts, some sleeping while others kept watch and warmed themselves by the rising heat of the floor. The temperature inside Pearl's cabin climbed to 56 degrees Fahrenheit, the highest of any building in Ironwood Gap. The blizzard continued without pause. On December 16th, the wind shifted slightly to the west, and snow began to pile against the eastern walls of the cabins. Anders Bjornsson's cabin had now become a shelter for 6 people. The McAllister family, parents and 4 children, had asked if they could shelter there on the evening of December 15th, and Anders had agreed immediately. With 9 people now sheltering in the cabin, the floor temperature had actually risen to 52 degrees Fahrenheit due to the body heat and increased interior activity. But more significantly, the psychological weight of shared survival had begun to work on the assembled group. Children stopped crying. Adults stopped calculating the dwindling supplies. Instead, there was the simple fact of warmth rising through the floor, hour after hour, night after night. By December 17th, the 5th full day of the blizzard, Caleb's logbook showed a fuel consumption rate that was almost exactly as he had predicted. 8 logs per 12-hour period, 16 logs per day, a rate that, if sustained, would consume his stockpile of 247 logs in approximately 15.4 days. But the storm showed no signs of abating, and the thermometer outside the shelter cottage read minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Caleb had expected this. He had anticipated that the worst of the cold would arrive in the 2nd week of the blizzard, not the 1st. He had also anticipated that other families would begin to fail, and they had. By the evening of December 17th, a total of 19 people were sheltering in the 4 cabins connected to the central flue system, the Moorefields, 3, Pearl's cabin, 9, including the Spences, Anders's cabin, 6, the McAllisters and 2 other families, and a smaller cabin that had been added to the southern flue that Caleb had only partially extended in November, which now sheltered 1 additional family, 2 people. The other 5 cabins in the settlement showed no lights, their occupants having chosen to retreat to neighboring cabins or to construct emergency shelters in the few structures the settlement maintained: a crude trading post, a tool storage building, and the schoolhouse. Inside the connected cabins, temperatures ranged from 48 degrees Fahrenheit to 56 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the thermometer had plummeted to minus 41 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was steady at approximately 35 miles per hour, creating a wind chill of approximately minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Caleb continued his 6-hour feeding schedule without deviation. On the morning of December 18th, the 7th day of the blizzard, he noted in his logbook that fuel consumption remained steady at 16 logs per day. He calculated that with 183 logs remaining, he had consumed 64 logs across 4 days of heavy burning. He could sustain the system for another 11.4 days. The blizzard could not possibly last longer than that. No blizzard on the Dakota frontier lasted more than 10 or 12 days without breaking. By the afternoon of December 18th, he had allowed himself to sleep for 4 hours, placing Anders Bjornsson in temporary charge of the fire pit with explicit instructions to maintain the 6-log feeding schedule and to record observations in the logbook. Anders performed the task with the seriousness of a man who understood that precision now meant the difference between comfort and crisis. When Caleb woke, Anders reported that the fire had been maintained perfectly. The flues had shown no signs of blockage or malfunction, and the temperatures in the 3 main cabins had remained stable. The blizzard continued through December 19th, 20th, and 21st without significant change. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the wind continued, and the temperature remained below -30 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the daylight hours. Inside the connected cabins, daily life had begun to establish a rhythm. Pearl Hitchcock, with the assistance of Margaret Spence, organized the cooking of meals using the resources stored in the 4 connected cabins. They had pooled their supplies: flour, salted meat, dried beans, coffee, sugar, and had begun rationing carefully. There was enough for 3 weeks, perhaps 4 if they were disciplined about portions. Sarah Moorefield set the children to small tasks that occupied their minds: counting beans for the next day's soup, rolling dough for bread, watching the thermometer, and recording temperatures every 4 hours. Reverend Spence, having accepted the shelter of the system he had publicly criticized, began a series of evening readings from scripture and sermons that, according to Pearl's later recollection, were among the most sincere and humble she had ever heard him deliver. Meanwhile, outside the 4 connected cabins, the situation had become dire. Caleb, on one of his necessary trips to the log pile on December 19th, observed that the other buildings in the settlement showed no smoke rising from their chimneys. The 5 isolated families and the others who had sought shelter in the community buildings were surviving. Certainly, death from cold would require exposure far more severe than what they faced. But they were surviving in cold, in crowded conditions, burning through resources that would not last through the end of winter. Caleb made no announcement of this observation. He did not need to. On the morning of December 21st, the 9th day of the blizzard, the wind began to diminish. By afternoon, the snow had resumed falling, but the wind had shifted to the north and the temperature had begun to climb slightly, only to -22 degrees Fahrenheit, but moving in the direction of improvement. By the evening of December the 21st, it was clear that the worst had passed. The families sheltering in the connected cabins began to cautiously discuss the possibility of returning to their own homes, though no one expressed particular urgency. The Spences, the McAllisters, and the others had experienced something that had not happened to them during any other winter on the frontier: sustained warmth during the most severe weather of the season. They had not been cold. They had not huddled around a single stove, burning fuel at ruinous rates. They had not been afraid that the wood would run out before the storm ended. On December 22nd, the blizzard broke completely. The wind ceased. The sun emerged from behind the remaining clouds, and the thermometer climbed to -2 degrees Fahrenheit by noon. The families began to depart, one by one, returning to their own cabins or to the community buildings where they had sheltered others. As they left, each thanked Caleb with varying degrees of sincerity. The McAllisters embraced him. Anders Bjornsson gripped his shoulder and said nothing. Pearl Hitchcock shook his hand and looked directly into his eyes. The Spences departed last. Margaret Spence took Caleb's hand briefly and nodded. Reverend Spence paused at the door and turned back toward Caleb. "I was wrong," the Reverend said simply. "I said, we'll know in January, but we knew in December, and we're alive because of your work." He did not apologize. His pride would not allow that, but the acknowledgement was complete. By the afternoon of December 22nd, the settlement began the work of assessing the damage and calculating survival. No lives had been lost. The 4 connected cabins had sheltered 19 people across 9 days of the worst weather of the winter. The central fire pit, burning 16 logs per day, had consumed 144 logs across 9 days of operation. A single cabin stove, Caleb calculated on the basis of documented fuel consumption in other settlements, would have consumed approximately 3 logs per hour during the blizzard. That was 72 logs per cabin per day, or 288 logs per day for 4 cabins burning simultaneously. The underground flue system had consumed less than 1/3 the fuel that 4 separate stoves would have required. Caleb calculated this figure carefully in his logbook and shared it with no one. But word traveled in a settlement as small as Ironwood Gap, and within 2 days, the entire community understood the mathematics of survival. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, Reverend Spence appeared at Caleb's door with a formal proposition. "Can the system be extended to 2 more cabins before next winter?" he asked. Caleb considered the question briefly and said, "Yes, the principle is established. 2 more runs, 1 southwest to the Patterson cabin, 1 east to the Morrison place. Total cost, perhaps 25 cents in additional brick and mortar. Same labor structure." Spence nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "I'll speak with the others," he said. "We'll build it together." Caleb said simply, "Come in November. We'll have it finished by December." Through the spring and summer of 1887, the underground flue system of Ironwood Gap expanded. First, the 2 additional cabins that Spence had proposed, the Patterson place and the Morrison residence. Then, in response to requests that came with increasing regularity, 2 more extensions, one to the Kowalski cabin, another to the Henderson family. By the autumn of 1887, 6 of the 9 cabins in Ironwood Gap had been connected to the central fire pit. The system had expanded to a total of 340 feet of brick-lined channels radiating outward from the central fire pit. The total cost of the system, materials only, had reached $1.35. The labor, nearly all of it, had been donated. Every able-bodied resident of the settlement had contributed at least 1 week of work to the expansion, carrying brick, mixing mortar, digging channels, and laying the stone that covered each run beneath the surface of the earth. Caleb Moorefield had become something he had not anticipated, the de facto engineer of Ironwood Gap. He was not a railroad engineer or a mining engineer. He was a bricklayer who understood heat, who had learned to think in terms of systems, and who had built a structure that did not fail when the worst that winter could offer descended on the settlement. When the winter of 1887 to 1888 arrived, 6 families sheltered through the season in connected cabins, burning a fraction of the fuel that would have been required to heat 6 separate structures. The system had become the foundation of the settlement's survival strategy. Other communities, hearing of the engineering through word of mouth and letter, began to inquire about the design. Caleb received 2 visitors in the spring of 1888, an engineer from a mining company in Colorado and a businessman from a new settlement in Montana, both seeking to understand the flue system in order to replicate it in their own communities. Caleb showed them his logbooks, his measurements, his calculations. He did not charge them for the information. "The knowledge is worth more than money," he told Sarah one evening. "If it saves other people, then it's done what it was meant to do." The inscription on the cornerstone of the expansion, laid in November 1887, read simply, "Ironwood Gap, 1886. 1 fire, 19 lives. We'll see you at the next warmth."